The rain drummed against the windows of the small diner on Route 66, each drop echoing the hollow beat of a heart that had almost stopped believing. Peter Cetera sat in the corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The once bright eyes that had captivated millions of fans across the world now stared blankly at the scarred wooden table, reflecting the weight of accusations that had destroyed everything he had spent a lifetime building, with careful dedication and unwavering integrity. The amber liquid in his cup had formed a thin film on top, untouched for the past 3 hours. Steam no longer rose from its surface, much like the hope that had once filled his heart. Peter's fingers traced the rim of the ceramic mug absently, his mind replaying the devastating events that had brought him to this lonely place on this desolate stretch of highway. 3 months. That's how long it had been since the headlines exploded across every major newspaper and news channel, like a devastating wildfire. Peter Cetera accused of financial fraud, charity funds missing. The words had cut deeper than any physical wound could ever penetrate, not because they were true, but because the world believed them without question or hesitation. His reputation, built painstakingly over decades of heartfelt music and genuine compassion for those less fortunate, crumbled in a matter of hours like a house of cards in a hurricane. The accusations had been specific and damning. Federal investigators claimed they had evidence showing that Peter had diverted over $1 million from his children's music foundation into personal offshore accounts. Bank records, they said, showed a pattern of fraudulent transfers spanning 18 months. Wire transfer authorizations bore his signature. The media painted him as another wealthy celebrity who had exploited the trust of charitable donors for personal gain. The media circus had been relentless and unforgiving, a feeding frenzy that consumed everything in its path. Former colleagues distanced themselves from him as if he carried a contagious disease. Concert venues canceled his shows without explanation, citing moral clauses in their contracts. Record executives who had once competed for his business now refused to return his calls. Charity organizations that had once begged for his endorsement now acted as if he had never existed, scrubbing his name from their websites and promotional materials. The isolation was suffocating, crushing his spirit with the weight of 1,000 abandoned friendships. His manager had dropped him via email. His publicist had released a statement distancing the agency from his alleged criminal activities. Even his own record label had suspended his contract pending the outcome of the investigation. The music industry, built on relationships and reputation, had turned its back on him with shocking speed and finality. The personal toll had been even more devastating than the professional one. Old friends stopped calling. Invitations to social events disappeared. His charitable work, which had been the source of his greatest pride and satisfaction, became a source of shame and suspicion. Children who had once lit up when he visited their schools now looked at him with confusion and fear. Their parents pulled them away when he approached, whispering warnings about that man who steals from charity. The diner was nearly empty, except for a middle-aged waitress who moved with the tired grace of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelty, but still chose to show kindness to strangers. She approached his table for the 3rd time that evening, her name tag reading Martha in faded letters that had seen better days. Her uniform was clean but worn, mended in places with careful stitches that spoke of financial necessity rather than fashion choice. Her shoes were practical rather than stylish, the kind worn by someone who spent long hours on her feet. Despite the obvious weariness in her eyes, her smile remained genuine and warm. "Honey, you sure you don't want something to eat?" Martha asked, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that only comes from a mother's heart that has known both joy and sorrow. "You've been sitting here for hours, and that coffee's got to be stone cold by now. The kitchen's still open for another hour, and our cook makes a mean chicken pot pie that'll warm you right up on a night like this." Peter looked up slowly, his movements deliberate and heavy. managing a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. The simple act of lifting his head felt like lifting a mountain, every muscle in his neck and shoulders screaming with tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Thank you, Martha. I truly appreciate your concern, but I'm not really hungry. Food doesn't seem to have much taste anymore. Everything just feels like cardboard." She studied his face for a moment with the intuitive wisdom that comes from years of observing human nature in all its complexity, and something flickered in her expression. A flash of recognition quickly replaced by deep sympathy. Her eyes, he noticed, held an intelligence that seemed at odds with her humble surroundings. There was something about her demeanor that suggested she had seen more of the world than a typical diner waitress, something that spoke of experiences beyond serving coffee and clearing tables. "You know," she said quietly, sliding uninvited into the seat across from him with the confidence of someone who understands when rules should be bent in favor of human compassion. "Sometimes when life knocks us down harder than we ever thought possible, we forget that getting back up isn't always about fighting back with our fists. Sometimes it's about letting the right people help us carry the load. Sometimes it's about accepting that we can't do everything alone, even when our pride tells us we should be able to." Peter's throat tightened with emotion he had been suppressing for months, threatening to spill over in a way that would embarrass them both. What if the right people don't exist anymore? What if everyone you trusted, everyone you believed would stand by you through thick and thin, has turned their back on you when you needed them most? What if the whole world has decided you're guilty without even bothering to hear your side of the story? Martha reached across the table and gently placed her weathered hand over his, her touch conveying more comfort than 1,000 words could express. Her skin was soft, despite the obvious years of hard work, and her grip was firm with the strength of someone who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. "Then maybe you haven't met the right person yet. Maybe that person is sitting right here in front of you in a place you never expected to find hope. Maybe God or the universe or whatever you believe in has brought you to this exact spot at this exact moment for a reason you can't see yet." The woman who saw what others missed. What Peter didn't know was that Martha Santos had been watching him for the past 3 hours, not with the curiosity of a starstruck fan seeking an autograph or a photo opportunity, but with the trained eye of someone who had spent 25 years as a private investigator before life forced her into early retirement. Her husband's mounting medical bills from his battle with cancer had drained their life savings completely, and pride had kept her from telling anyone about her past profession or asking for help from former colleagues who might have offered assistance. The diner job paid just enough to keep them barely afloat, covering the rent on their modest apartment and putting food on the table. But her investigative instincts never truly went to sleep. Even while serving coffee and taking orders, her mind remained active, always analyzing, always questioning what others accepted at face value. She noticed things that others missed, the way people held themselves, the subtle tells that revealed their true emotional state, the inconsistencies between what they said and what their body language communicated. She had recognized Peter the moment he walked through the door, shoulders sagging under the weight of his public disgrace like Atlas carrying the world. The local news had run his story multiple times, and his face had been plastered across newspaper front pages for weeks. But where others saw a fallen celebrity who had betrayed the public trust, Martha saw something entirely different. The distinctive posture of an innocent man being slowly crushed by circumstances completely beyond his control. She had seen it countless times in her career, the way genuine victims carried themselves differently from those who were truly guilty. It was in the subtle details that most people never noticed. The way innocent people's shoulders curved inward as if trying to protect themselves from an invisible assault. The way their eyes held confusion rather than the calculating wariness of the truly guilty. The way they moved through the world with the bewildered uncertainty of someone who couldn't understand how their reality had been turned upside down. Guilty people, in her extensive experience, either projected aggressive defiance or tried too hard to appear innocent, overcompensating with elaborate explanations and carefully rehearsed expressions of wounded dignity. But Peter displayed neither behavior pattern. Instead, he showed the quiet devastation of someone who couldn't comprehend how his world had turned upside down so completely and so quickly. His movements were those of a man walking through a nightmare, hoping desperately to wake up and find that none of it was real. There were other tells as well. The way he held his hands, the rhythm of his breathing, the micro-expressions that flitted across his face when he thought no one was looking. Martha had spent decades learning to read these signs, and everything about Peter Cetera screamed innocence to her trained eye. This was a man who had been blindsided by betrayal, not someone trying to cover up his own crimes. "Mr. Cetera," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper to avoid drawing attention from the few other patrons scattered throughout the diner. "My name is Martha Santos, and I used to be a private investigator before life happened and changed everything I thought I knew about my future. I've been following your case in the news with professional interest, and I want you to know that I don't believe a single word of those accusations that have been destroying your life." Peter's eyes widened in genuine surprise, the first real emotion she had seen cross his features since he arrived. The spark of hope that flickered there was quickly tempered by wariness. He had been burned too many times by people who claimed to support him only to betray that trust later. It had been months since anyone had spoken to him with anything other than suspicion, pity, or barely concealed disdain. You actually believe I'm innocent?" he asked, his voice hoarse with disuse and emotion. "Even with all the evidence they say they have against me? Even with the bank records and the signatures and all the rest of it?" "I don't just believe it in my heart," Martha said with the firm conviction that had made her one of the best investigators in the state during her active years. "I can prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. But I'm going to need your complete cooperation. And more importantly, I'm going to need you to trust me with information that could be used against you if I were the wrong person. I need you to tell me everything, even the parts that might make you look bad or that you think might incriminate you further." The rain continued to fall outside with increasing intensity, drumming against the windows with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. For the first time in months, Peter felt a tiny spark of hope flickering in the suffocating darkness that had consumed his life and left him feeling utterly alone in the world. But hope, he had learned, could be dangerous. It could lead to disappointment so crushing that it might finally break what little spirit he had left. "Why would you want to help me?" he asked cautiously. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. And getting involved in this mess could damage your own reputation if people find out you're trying to help someone they think is a criminal." Martha smiled sadly, and for a moment, he caught a glimpse of deep pain in her eyes. The kind of pain that comes from profound loss. "Because my husband Carlos believed in justice with his whole heart, and he believed in you long before he ever met you. Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. And because if I don't help you, who will?" Uncovering the deception. Over the next several hours, as the diner gradually emptied of its few remaining customers, and the night grew deeper around them, Martha shared her story with the kind of precise detail that comes from years of meticulous documentation and careful observation. Her husband Carlos had been diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer 2 years earlier, a devastating blow that had turned their comfortable middle-class life into a desperate struggle for survival and dignity. The diagnosis had come without warning during what should have been a routine physical exam. Carlos had been feeling tired lately, but they had attributed it to the stress of his job as a maintenance supervisor at a large office complex downtown. The doctor's somber expression when he delivered the news had changed their lives forever in the span of a single sentence. "I'm afraid it's cancer, and it's already spread quite extensively. The experimental treatments that insurance refused to cover, claiming they were investigational and not medically necessary, had forced them to mortgage their house twice and eventually sell the private investigation business she had built from absolutely nothing over 2.5 decades of relentless hard work and determination. The business had been her pride and joy, built client by client and case by case, until she had earned a reputation as one of the most thorough and honest investigators in the region. Carlos was the love of my life, Martha explained, her voice thick with emotion that she rarely allowed herself to show, especially to strangers. We met when I was investigating a workers' compensation fraud case at the hospital, where he worked as a maintenance supervisor. Someone was claiming to be injured on the job when they were actually perfectly healthy, and I needed to document their daily activities to prove the fraud. Carlos caught me taking surveillance photos in the parking lot and confronted me about it. She smiled at the memory, the first genuine smile Peter had seen from her. Instead of being angry or suspicious, he was fascinated by what I did for a living. He said he'd always believed that truth was the most important thing in the world, and that people who fought for truth were doing God's work. He was the kindest, most honest man I'd ever met, and he believed with his whole heart that everyone deserved justice, regardless of their station in life or how much money they had in the bank. Carlos had courted her with old-fashioned charm and unwavering integrity. He brought her flowers from his own garden, wrote her letters by hand, and treated her with a respect that she had rarely encountered in her professional or personal life. When they married, he became not just her husband, but her partner in every sense of the word, helping with her cases when he could, providing emotional support during the difficult investigations, and celebrating her successes as if they were his own. The cancer had stolen not just his life, but their future together. The retirement they had planned, the trips they had dreamed of taking, the simple pleasure of growing old together. But even as the disease ravaged his body, Carlos's spirit had remained strong, his belief in justice unwavering. She had taken the job at the diner to keep them above the poverty line, swallowing her pride and accepting work that paid a fraction of what she had earned as a successful investigator. The tips were modest, the hours were long, and the work was physically demanding, but it provided just enough income to cover their basic needs. But her mind remained razor sharp, always analyzing patterns, always questioning official narratives, always seeing details that others missed or dismissed as irrelevant. "The first thing that bothered me about your case," Martha explained, pulling out a small notebook she kept meticulously in her apron pocket, its pages filled with neat handwriting and careful observations, "was the timing of everything. The accusations surfaced just 3 days before your new charity initiative was supposed to launch, the one that would have provided comprehensive music education to underserved communities across the entire country." Peter nodded slowly, the memory clearly painful to revisit. The timing had seemed like a cruel coincidence at first, but now he was beginning to see it in a different light. The foundation had been working on that project for over 2 years. We had partnerships lined up with major corporations, universities, and local community centers. The program would have provided free instruments, professional instruction, and performance opportunities to children who couldn't afford private music lessons. It would have changed thousands of lives, given opportunities to kids who never dreamed they could afford to learn piano or violin or guitar. The project had been his personal passion, born from his own childhood memories of struggling to afford music lessons and instruments. He remembered the crushing disappointment when his family couldn't afford to rent a trumpet for the school band, the feeling of being left out while other children pursued their musical dreams. He had vowed that if he ever had the means, he would make sure no child faced that same disappointment. "Exactly," Martha continued, her investigative instincts fully engaged now, the same intensity she had brought to dozens of cases over the years. And who had complete access to the Foundation's financial records and authorization procedures? Who would have been in a position to manipulate the system from the inside? Peter's expression grew troubled as he considered the implications of her question, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't wanted to see beginning to fall into place. my business manager, Richard Holbrook, and my attorney, David Chen. They've both been with me for over 15 years. I trusted them with everything: my finances, my legal affairs, my reputation, my charitable work. They had power of attorney for certain transactions, access to all the accounts, knowledge of all the procedures. They were like family to me. I trusted them more than I trusted my own relatives. The betrayal was even more painful than the accusations themselves. These weren't strangers who had targeted him for unknown reasons. These were men he had considered close friends, people he had confided in, people he had trusted with his most personal and professional secrets. Richard had been the best man at his second wedding. David had been a frequent guest at his home, had played poker with him monthly for over a decade. Martha made detailed notes as he spoke, her handwriting quick but precise, the product of years of documenting witness statements and preserving crucial details. Trust is a beautiful thing, Mr. Cetera, but it can also be dangerously blind when we care about people. In my experience, unfortunately, the people closest to us often have the most opportunity and the strongest motives to betray that trust for personal gain. They know our weaknesses, our patterns, our blind spots. They know exactly how to exploit our faith in them. She had seen it countless times in her career. Business partners who embezzled from their lifelong friends, spouses who drained joint accounts before filing for divorce, children who defrauded elderly parents by manipulating their trust and affection. The closer the relationship, the easier the betrayal, because trust eliminated the very safeguards that protected against fraud. But here's what bothers me most about the evidence against you, Martha continued, flipping through her notebook to find specific observations she had made. The financial transfers all happened during specific time periods when you were on tour or recording, times when you would have been completely occupied with your professional obligations and less likely to be monitoring the day-to-day operations of the foundation. The signatures on the authorization documents, while they appear genuine at first glance, show subtle inconsistencies that suggest forgery by someone who had access to legitimate samples of your handwriting. She reached into her purse and carefully pulled out a small digital recording device, handling it like the precious evidence it represented. I've been doing some investigative work on my own time over the past several weeks, making discreet calls to old contacts in the industry, following paper trails, and gathering information that the police seem to have overlooked or ignored. What I found might shock you to your very core, but it will also vindicate you completely. The device was small and unassuming, but Martha handled it with the reverence of someone who understood its potential to change lives. She had purchased it years ago for surveillance work, and its battery life and audio quality had never failed her when she needed them most. "Before I play this for you," she said seriously, "I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear will destroy any remaining faith you might have in the people you trusted most. It will confirm your worst fears about human nature and the capacity for betrayal, but it will also set you free from the nightmare you've been living. Are you prepared for that?" Peter took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever revelation was about to change his life. "Play it," he said quietly. "I need to know the truth, no matter how much it hurts." The shocking revelation. The device crackled to life with crystal clear audio quality, and Peter heard a conversation that made his blood run cold with betrayal and disbelief. The voices were unmistakably familiar, recorded with such clarity that every word was perfectly audible. "The final transfer needs to be completed before the federal audit next week," came the unmistakably familiar voice of Richard Holbrook, speaking in hushed but urgent tones that carried the tension of conspiracy. "Once the money is safely deposited in the offshore account, we can make it look like Cetera personally authorized all the transactions through his normal channels. The old fool trusts us so completely and blindly. He'll never see it coming until it's far too late to do anything about it." Peter's hands began to shake as he recognized not just the voice, but the callous tone, the casual cruelty in referring to him as the old fool. This was a man he had considered a brother, someone he had trusted with his most sensitive financial affairs for over a decade and a half. "What about the documentation trail?" asked another voice that Peter recognized with growing horror as his longtime attorney David Chen, the man who had guided him through contract negotiations, protected his interests in business deals, and provided legal counsel on everything from real estate purchases to charitable giving strategies. The federal authorities will want to see written authorization for transactions of this magnitude. They'll scrutinize every document with forensic accountants and handwriting experts. "I've already forged his signature on all the transfer orders using samples from legitimate documents in our files," Holbrook replied with chilling casualness, as if discussing something as mundane as ordering office supplies. "I've been practicing his signature for months, studying the pressure patterns and stroke variations. I've got it down perfectly. Even his banker won't be able to tell the difference. By the time anyone realizes what actually happened here, we'll be living comfortably in countries with no extradition treaties, and he'll be left holding the bag for our crimes." The conversation continued with horrifying detail. They discussed timing, logistics, and contingency plans with the thoroughness of professional criminals. They had researched which countries would be most welcoming to wealthy Americans seeking to avoid prosecution. They had already opened accounts in multiple banks across 3 different continents. They had even discussed how to leak information to the media to ensure maximum damage to Peter's reputation. "The beauty of this plan," Chen's voice continued with obvious satisfaction, "is that we're not just stealing the money, we're destroying him completely. After this scandal breaks, he'll never work in the music industry again. No one will trust him with charitable work. His legacy will be ruined forever. Even if he somehow proves his innocence years from now, the damage will be irreversible." Peter felt physically nauseated as he listened to these men, whom he had considered family, discussing the systematic destruction of his life with the same clinical detachment they might use to discuss a business merger. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it defied comprehension. "What about the charity project he's so passionate about?" Holbrook asked. "The Music Education Initiative?" "That's the most delicious part," Chen replied with audible amusement. "We're not just stealing money from him. We're stealing hope from thousands of children who are counting on that program. The media will eat up the irony. The man who claimed to want to help disadvantaged children was actually stealing from them. It's perfect." Peter's hands trembled uncontrollably as the recording continued, revealing detail after sickening detail of how his 2 most trusted advisors had systematically stolen not just hundreds of thousands of dollars from his charity, but had carefully orchestrated an elaborate frame job designed to make him appear guilty of their crimes while simultaneously destroying his ability to ever recover from the scandal. The recording captured nearly 40 minutes of conversation, covering multiple meetings over several weeks. They discussed forging additional documents, manipulating computer records, and even bribing a bank employee to provide false testimony if needed. They had thought of everything, planned for every contingency except the one that had actually occurred, being overheard and recorded by someone with the skills and determination to expose their crimes. The price of truth and sacrifice. "How in the world did you manage to get this recording?" Peter asked, his voice barely above a whisper, still struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal he had just heard with his own ears. The voices of men he had trusted completely, discussing his destruction as if it were a business transaction. Martha's expression grew solemn and deeply sad, the weight of recent loss evident in every line of her face. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet dignity of someone who had faced unimaginable loss and emerged with her integrity intact. "My husband Carlos worked nights as a janitor at the law firm where your attorney maintains his downtown offices. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid better than most night jobs, and the medical insurance helped with his cancer treatments." She paused, collecting herself before continuing with the most painful part of her story. The cancer treatments had made him weak and frail, but his hearing was still sharp as a tack. and his sense of justice was stronger than ever. He overheard them planning the whole elaborate scheme during one of their late-night meetings when they thought the building was empty, except for security and cleaning staff. Carlos had been emptying waste baskets in the conference room adjacent to Chen's office when he heard voices through the thin wall. At first, he had tried to ignore the conversation, focusing on his work and respecting the privacy that wealthy clients expected. But when he heard Peter Cetera's name mentioned in connection with criminal activity, his attention had been captured. As a longtime fan of Peter's music, Carlos had been shocked by the fraud allegations when they first surfaced. But something about the accusations had never sat right with him. He had followed Peter's charitable work for years, had seen the genuine passion in interviews when the musician discussed helping disadvantaged children. The idea that such a man would steal from charity seemed inconsistent with everything Carlos had observed about his character. Carlos managed to record several of their conversations using an old surveillance device I had given him years earlier for personal protection, Martha continued, her voice growing stronger as she honored her husband's memory with the truth. He was terrified of being discovered, but he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent man be destroyed by people who were supposed to protect him. The recordings had been made over a period of 3 weeks, with Carlos carefully timing his cleaning schedule to coincide with the conspirators' meetings. He had risked his job, his health insurance, and potentially his safety to gather evidence that could exonerate a man he had never met but believed was innocent. "He died just 6 weeks ago," Martha said, her voice breaking slightly with grief that was still fresh and raw. "But not before he made me promise to use this evidence to clear your name and bring those criminals to justice. He said that good people like you deserve to be protected from evil ones like them, and that letting them get away with their crimes would be a betrayal of everything he believed in about right and wrong." The last conversation they had shared in the hospital had been about Peter's case, even as morphine clouded his thoughts and pain racked his body. Carlos had insisted that Martha take the recordings to the authorities. He had made her swear on their wedding rings that she would see justice done, no matter how long it took or how difficult the process became. Peter felt his heart clench with a mixture of grief for her loss and overwhelming gratitude for the sacrifice her husband had made. "Martha, I'm so deeply sorry for your loss." Carlos sounds like he was an extraordinary man with incredible integrity and courage. "But why are you taking such enormous risks to help a complete stranger? You could face retaliation from dangerous people who have already proven they'll destroy lives to protect their secrets." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of genuine concern. Peter had learned firsthand how ruthless people could be when their criminal activities were threatened with exposure. If Holbrook and Chen discovered that their conversations had been recorded, they might well target Martha with the same systematic destruction they had visited upon him. Tears glistened in Martha's eyes as she struggled to maintain her composure, but her voice remained steady and determined. Because Carlos believed in justice with his whole heart, and he believed in you as a person long before he ever met you. Your music got us through some of the darkest, most terrifying nights during his treatments when we didn't know if he would live to see another sunrise. When Hard to Say I'm Sorry played softly in his hospital room during those endless nights of pain and fear, he would squeeze my hand with what little strength he had left and tell me that everything would eventually be okay because there were still good people in the world like you. She wiped her eyes with a napkin, her voice growing stronger with determination and purpose. "But there's much more evidence than just this recording, Mr. Cetera. I have documented proof of the offshore accounts they established, copies of the forged signatures that I had analyzed by a handwriting expert who confirmed they were sophisticated forgeries, and sworn testimony from a whistleblower at the bank who became suspicious about the unusual transaction patterns and kept detailed records of everything he observed." Martha had used every investigative skill she had developed over 25 years to build an airtight case. She had traced the money through multiple banks and offshore institutions. She had documented the timeline of events with precision that would impress federal prosecutors. She had even identified additional victims, other clients of Chen's law firm who had been defrauded using similar methods. "I have everything we need to completely clear your name and put those men in prison where they belong for a very long time," she continued with growing confidence. "But more than that, I have evidence that will restore your reputation and allow you to continue the charitable work that means so much to you." Peter stared in amazement at this remarkable woman who had appeared in his life like a guardian angel precisely when he needed one most desperately. The thoroughness of her investigation, the risks she had taken, the sacrifice she was making. It was almost incomprehensible that a stranger would do so much for someone she had never met. "Martha, you could have sold this information to the highest bidder in the media circus," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Television networks and tabloid magazines would have paid you an absolute fortune for this exclusive story and evidence. You could have secured your financial future and never had to work in a diner again." She shook her head firmly, her integrity as solid as granite and just as immovable. "Money can't bring back my beloved husband, and it certainly can't buy back a good man's reputation or restore faith in justice. Some things in this world are infinitely more important than profit or personal gain. Carlos taught me that the measure of a person isn't how much they accumulate, but how much they're willing to sacrifice for what's right." The moment of reckoning and vindication. The next morning, as the sun rose over a world that was about to change dramatically for both of them, Martha and Peter walked together into the imposing federal building that housed the FBI field office. The building's marble columns and formal architecture seemed designed to intimidate, but Martha approached it with the confidence of someone who had spent decades working within the system and understood how to navigate its complexities. Special Agent Rebecca Walsh, a stern woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and penetrating brown eyes that had seen every kind of deception imaginable, listened with obvious skepticism as Martha methodically presented her meticulously gathered evidence. The agent's initial demeanor suggested she had heard countless conspiracy theories and false accusations from people seeking to clear guilty relatives or friends. "Mrs. Santos," Agent Walsh began with the weary tone of someone who had investigated hundreds of financial fraud cases and learned to be suspicious of dramatic revelations. "Do you understand the serious nature of the allegations you're making against respected members of the legal and financial communities? Both Mr. Holbrook and Mr. Chen have sterling reputations and no previous criminal history. These are substantial accusations that could destroy their careers and reputations if they prove to be unfounded." But as the crystal-clear recordings played in the sterile conference room and the damning documents were carefully reviewed by federal investigators with expertise in financial crimes, the agent's expression gradually shifted from professional doubt to genuine amazement, and then to barely controlled anger at the audacity of the crimes that had been committed. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Martha had not only recorded the conspirators' conversations, but had also documented the paper trail of their crimes with the precision of a forensic accountant. She had traced the movement of funds through multiple institutions, identified the specific techniques used to forge Peter's signature, and even located witnesses who could testify about suspicious activities they had observed. "Mrs. Santos," Agent Walsh said after nearly 4 hours of examining the evidence, her tone now filled with professional respect and admiration. "This is some of the most thorough and professionally executed investigative work I've seen from a civilian in my 20-year career with the Bureau. The level of detail, the quality of the documentation, the strength of the evidence. It's remarkable. How long did it take you to compile all of this irrefutable proof?" "Every spare moment I had over the past 6 weeks," Martha replied with quiet dignity that impressed everyone in the room. "I knew Mr. Cetera was innocent from the very beginning based on my professional experience reading people and understanding behavioral patterns, but proving it required infinite patience, careful persistence, and the willingness to follow every lead no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The federal investigation that followed moved with unprecedented speed. Within hours of the evidence being presented, federal agents armed with search warrants had arrested both Richard Holbrook and David Chen at their respective homes in dramatic raids that made the evening news. Television crews captured footage of the two men being led away in handcuffs, their faces hidden behind jackets as neighbors watched in shock. The evidence against them was so overwhelming and comprehensive that both men confessed within hours of their capture, hoping desperately for reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation with ongoing investigations. They revealed additional crimes, identified other victims, and provided details about money laundering operations that led to further arrests. The stolen money, all $1, $2 million of it, was recovered from multiple offshore accounts in 3 different countries. Federal prosecutors worked with international banking authorities to freeze assets and repatriate funds with remarkable efficiency. Peter's name was completely cleared of all charges, and the Department of Justice issued a formal statement acknowledging his innocence and apologizing for the investigation that had destroyed his reputation. But the real surprise came when Agent Walsh pulled Martha aside privately after the arrests had been made and the paperwork had been completed. Mrs. Santos, the Bureau has been actively searching for someone with your particular combination of skills, integrity, and dedication to justice. We have a senior consultant position available that would pay significantly more than your current employment, with full benefits including comprehensive health coverage that would have helped your husband during his illness. The position involves consulting on complex financial fraud cases where your investigative experience would be invaluable. Would you be interested in discussing this opportunity? Martha's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude as she realized that her willingness to fight for justice had not only cleared an innocent man's name, but it also opened the door to a new career that would allow her to honor Carlos's memory while rebuilding her own life. After months of struggling just to pay basic bills and keep food on the table, here was an unexpected opportunity to return to the work she loved while making a real difference in the world. "I would be honored to serve," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. Carlos always said that the fight for justice never ends. It just changes battlefields. I can't think of a better way to honor his memory than by continuing that fight. A new beginning, built on redemption. 3 months later, Peter Cetera stood once again on the stage of the historic Chicago Theater, performing for the first time since his name had been completely cleared and his reputation restored. The venue held special significance for him. It was where he had performed some of his most memorable concerts during the height of his career, and returning there felt like coming home after a long and painful exile. The sold-out audience of 3,000 people gave him a thunderous standing ovation that lasted nearly 15 minutes, with many fans openly weeping as they welcomed back a man they had never stopped believing in, despite the overwhelming evidence that had been presented against him. The applause was more than just appreciation for his music. It was an acknowledgement of his suffering, a celebration of his vindication, and a collective expression of relief that justice had ultimately prevailed. But throughout the emotional outpouring of support, Peter's eyes searched the crowd until he found Martha Santos sitting in the front row, wearing a crisp new business suit that reflected her return to professional life, and displaying the first genuinely peaceful smile he had seen on her face since they first met in that roadside diner. Next to her sat an empty chair with a single red rose placed on the seat, a tribute to Carlos and his role in exposing the truth. The concert was a triumphant celebration of resilience, redemption, and the power of truth to overcome even the most elaborate deceptions. Peter performed both classic hits that had defined his career and new songs he had written during his darkest hours, including a haunting ballad called Martha's Song that told the story of an angel who appeared when hope seemed lost forever. The lyrics spoke of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of love that transcends death, and of the courage required to stand up for truth when the whole world seems to believe a lie. When he performed Martha's Song, the entire audience fell silent, hanging on every word as Peter's voice conveyed the depth of his gratitude and the power of the story he was telling. Many people in the audience had followed his case in the media, and they understood the personal significance of the song and the woman it honored. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the theater. After the emotionally charged show, they met backstage in his dressing room, surrounded by flowers and congratulatory messages from fans and colleagues who had rediscovered their faith in his character. The room buzzed with the energy of vindication and celebration. But Peter felt most grateful for the quiet presence of the woman who had made it all possible. Peter handed her an envelope with her name written in his careful, distinctive handwriting. The same handwriting that had been so expertly forged by the men who had tried to destroy him. "Martha, I want you to have this," he said with deep emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "It's a certified check for $2 million. My way of saying thank you for giving me back not just my reputation, but my faith in human goodness and the power of truth to prevail against overwhelming odds." Martha shook her head gently but firmly, her integrity unchanged by the magnitude of the gesture. "Mr. Cetera, I cannot and will not accept this generous gift. What I did because it was morally right and because my husband would have expected nothing less from me, not because I expected any kind of payment or reward. Justice isn't something you buy or sell. It's something you fight for because it's right." "I understand completely, and that's exactly why you deserve it more than anyone else in the world," Peter replied with conviction that came from months of contemplating how to properly thank the woman who had saved his life. "But if you won't take it for yourself and your own future security, then please take it for Carlos's memory and the values he represented. Use it to start a foundation in his name, something that helps families dealing with cancer navigate the financial and emotional challenges, something that ensures no one has to choose between seeking justice and basic survival." The idea had been forming in Peter's mind for weeks as he watched Martha struggle with the financial realities of her situation, while simultaneously fighting to clear his name. He had witnessed firsthand the impossible choices that families facing serious illness were forced to make, and he wanted to create something that would honor both Carlos's memory and Martha's sacrifice. Tears streamed down Martha's cheeks as she realized the beautiful and profound irony of the moment. The man she had risked everything to save was now saving her in return, creating something meaningful and lasting from their shared pain and struggle. The foundation would not only help other families, but would also ensure that Carlos's final act of courage would continue to make a difference in the world long after his death. "There's one more thing I want to ask of you," Peter added with growing excitement about the possibilities ahead. "I want you to be the executive director of this foundation. You've proven beyond any doubt that you have the integrity, the investigative skills, and the unwavering commitment to justice needed to make sure the money actually helps people who desperately need it, instead of lining the pockets of corrupt administrators." The offer represented more than just a job. It was an opportunity for Martha to combine her professional skills with her personal mission to honor her husband's memory. She would be able to help other families facing the same impossible choices they had faced, while also using her investigative expertise to ensure that charitable funds were used properly and efficiently. Martha looked at the substantial check in her hands, thinking of Carlos and how incredibly proud he would be of this moment and this opportunity to help others facing similar struggles. "I accept your offer," she said softly, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions she felt. "But only if you'll agree to be the honorary chairman and help me make sure we're doing everything right and staying true to our mission." Peter smiled with genuine joy, the first completely authentic smile he had managed in over a year of darkness and despair. "It would be my absolute honor and privilege to work alongside you in this endeavor." The ripple effect of justice and compassion. The Carlos Santos Foundation for Cancer Patient Advocacy became one of the most respected and effective charitable organizations in the entire country within its first year of operation. helping thousands of families navigate the complex financial and emotional challenges of cancer treatment while maintaining their dignity and hope. The foundation's approach was comprehensive, addressing not just immediate financial needs but also providing emotional support, advocacy services, and connections to resources that many families never knew existed. Martha's investigative skills and uncompromising standards proved invaluable, not only in running their own programs efficiently, but also in identifying and exposing fraud in other charitable organizations that were exploiting vulnerable people during their most desperate moments. She developed a reputation for thoroughness and honesty that attracted both donors, who wanted to ensure their contributions were used properly, and other organizations that sought her seal of approval for their programs. Within 2 years, she had become known throughout the nonprofit sector as the guardian angel of charitable integrity, and her reputation for identifying fraudulent charities and corrupt administrators led to significant reforms in how charitable organizations were monitored and regulated. Government agencies began consulting with her on investigations, and her expertise helped recover millions of dollars that had been stolen from legitimate charitable causes. Peter's music career experienced a remarkable renaissance that surprised even his most optimistic supporters and industry observers. The public revelation of his innocence, combined with the compelling story of how justice had been achieved, created a groundswell of support that transcended his existing fan base. His new album, Songs of Redemption, topped the charts for 12 consecutive weeks, with all proceeds going to various carefully vetted charities that Martha had helped him research and verify. The title track, Martha's Song, became an international anthem for anyone who had ever been wrongly accused, forgotten by society, or lost hope in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Radio stations around the world played it regularly, and it became a rallying cry for criminal justice reform and victim advocacy organizations. The song's message of hope emerging from despair resonated with people facing their own struggles against injustice and corruption. But perhaps more importantly than professional success, their friendship became a beacon of hope and inspiration for anyone who had ever lost faith in human goodness or the possibility of justice in an unfair world. They appeared together at charity events across the country, speaking passionately about the power of believing in innocence until proven otherwise, and the critical importance of standing up for truth even when it seems impossible and the whole world appears to be against you. Their story was featured in documentaries, news specials, and magazine articles that highlighted both the dangers of rushing to judgment and the power of individual citizens to make a difference when they're willing to take risks for what's right. Law schools began using their case as an example of how the justice system can fail, but also how it can be corrected when good people refuse to accept injustice. The legacy of truth and friendship. The foundation's work expanded beyond cancer advocacy to include assistance for families facing other medical crises and financial hardships. They established scholarship programs for children whose parents had been wrongly accused of crimes, recognizing that the families of the falsely accused often suffered tremendous hardship even when justice eventually prevailed. Martha's investigative work led to the creation of a new federal task force focused on charity fraud, and she was appointed as a special advisor to help develop new protocols for investigating financial crimes involving nonprofit organizations. Her expertise helped create safeguards that protected both donors and recipients from the kind of elaborate fraud schemes that had almost destroyed Peter's life. Peter's charitable giving became legendary in its scope and impact. The music education program that had been derailed by the false accusations was not only revived, but expanded dramatically, ultimately reaching over 50,000 children across the country. The program provided not just instruments and lessons, but also opportunities for performance, recording, and even college scholarships for exceptional students. Their partnership extended to other areas as well. When natural disasters struck, they worked together to ensure that relief funds were distributed efficiently and honestly. When other celebrities faced false accusations, Martha offered her investigative services pro bono to help separate truth from malicious rumors. When families couldn't afford private investigators to help clear wrongly accused relatives, the foundation provided funding for professional assistance. The friendship between Peter and Martha became a powerful symbol of how tragedy could be transformed into purpose, how loss could become the foundation for helping others, and how the worst of human nature could bring out the best in those who chose to fight against it. Their example inspired countless others to stand up for justice in their own communities and to refuse to accept injustice even when fighting it required personal sacrifice. The final truth and lasting legacy. 1 year after that life-changing rainy night in the humble diner on Route 66, Peter and Martha returned together to the same establishment where their paths had first crossed and their partnership in justice had begun. The owner, touched by their story and its impact on his community, had installed a small bronze plaque by their old corner booth that read, "Where Truth Found Its Voice," in memory of Carlos Santos and in honor of all those who fight for justice against overwhelming odds. The diner had become something of a pilgrimage site for people seeking inspiration or hope in their own struggles against injustice. Travelers would stop specifically to sit in the booth where Martha and Peter had first met, hoping to find some of the courage and determination that had led to such an extraordinary outcome. As they sat once again in the familiar booth, now as close friends bound by shared purpose and mutual respect, Martha pulled out a letter that had arrived in her office that morning. The envelope bore the return address of a federal prison, and she recognized the handwriting immediately. "It's from Richard Holbrook," she said quietly, her voice reflecting the complexity of emotions that dealing with their former enemies always brought. "He's written from prison to apologize sincerely and to tell us that witnessing how we responded to his betrayal with grace rather than bitterness made him want to become a better person and make amends for his crimes." The letter was several pages long and filled with genuine remorse. Holbrook wrote about the shame he felt for betraying Peter's trust, the pain he had caused to innocent families who had been counting on the charity programs, and his determination to spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for his actions. He had become a model prisoner, helping other inmates with financial literacy programs and working to expose corruption within the prison system. Peter shook his head in continued amazement at the unexpected turns their journey had taken. It's incredible to think that even our enemies can be redeemed if they're truly willing to face the truth about their actions and take responsibility for the harm they've caused. Carlos would have believed that redemption was possible for everyone, wouldn't he? Martha smiled with the wisdom that comes from surviving life's deepest trials and emerging with faith intact. Carlos always said that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what people did wrong or pretending that crimes don't matter, but about freeing ourselves from the poison of hatred and bitterness that can destroy us from within. He believed that everyone deserved a chance at redemption if they were truly repentant. I think he would be incredibly proud of how this entire situation turned out and how we chose to respond to evil with good. The conversation was interrupted by a young woman who approached their table hesitantly. She was in her early 30s, well-dressed but nervous, carrying a folder filled with documents. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Are you Martha Santos and Peter Cetera? I've been looking for you. My name is Susan Walsh, and I think someone is trying to frame my husband the same way they framed you, Mr. Cetera. I've been following your story and I was wondering if you might be willing to help us." Martha and Peter exchanged a meaningful look. This was exactly the kind of situation they had hoped to address through their foundation and their continued partnership. Without hesitation, Martha gestured to the empty seat across from them. "Please, sit down and tell us your story," Martha said with the same warmth and determination that had first given Peter hope in this very booth. "That's exactly why we're here." As they sat together in comfortable silence after Susan had left with their promise to investigate her husband's case, watching the sunset paint the endless sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to promise hope for tomorrow, both Martha and Peter understood that they had discovered something rare and precious in this world. The truth that real justice isn't primarily about punishment or revenge, but about restoration and healing. It's about taking broken things and broken people and making them whole again, not just for ourselves, but for everyone whose lives we have the privilege to touch along the way. It's about understanding that the fight for justice never truly ends. It just finds new battlefields and new heroes willing to take up the cause. The same waitress who had served them that first night approached their table with a warm smile of recognition. She had become something of a local celebrity herself, known as the woman who had witnessed the beginning of one of the most remarkable stories of justice and redemption in recent memory. "Can I get you folks anything else tonight?" she asked, her voice filled with the pride that comes from being part of something larger than yourself. Peter and Martha looked at each other and smiled with the contentment that comes from knowing you've made a difference that will last long after you're gone. "Just the check, please," Martha said with quiet satisfaction. "We have important work to do, and people are counting on us." Because that's what real heroes do. They take the grace and justice they've been given and use it to light the way for others who are still lost in the darkness, proving every single day that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to give up on the truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge from the shadows, or how many people try to keep it buried. And somewhere in heaven, Carlos Santos smiled, knowing that his final act of courage had created ripples of justice that would continue spreading for generations to come, touching lives he would never know, and inspiring acts of courage he would never witness, but which carried forward his unwavering belief that truth and justice were worth any sacrifice. The end. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that justice and goodness still exist in our world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories about real people who made a difference when it mattered most. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had someone believe in you when no one else would? Have you ever been the person who stood up for someone else's truth when it was difficult or dangerous? Your stories matter deeply, and we'd love to hear them. Remember, in a world that often feels dark and uncertain, we all have the power to be someone's Martha Santos, the person who sees the truth when everyone else has given up looking for it, and who chooses to act on that truth regardless of the personal cost. Sometimes justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it's justice that's waiting for the right person to fight for it.